Having defined ecological explanations of environmental degradation, in the second part of this video lecture, we will discuss basically theoretical explanations of environmental reforms. Like I told you in the beginning, while in the initial years, the important sociological questions was to explain what are the causes of environmental degradation, whereas from 1990s, sociological discourse has moved or has shifted to understand explanations of environmental reforms, or in other words, how environmental alterations, how environmental reforms can be brought forward, and what sociological factors are important in that. Frederick Bottle proposes 4 channels for environmental improvement. He says that in the modern times or in the contemporary times, there are 4 important sociological processes which are responsible to bring environmental reforms. They are environmental activism or environmental movements, second, environmental regulations, third, ecological modernization, and fourth, international environmental governance. With regard to environmental movements, Bottle says that environmental movements have great power in contemporary times. They have the power to force the state or to negotiate with the state to come out with more and more eco-friendly policies, more and more environmental friendly policies. So, therefore, Bottle has a great hope that environmental movements or social movements concerning environment will help in bringing out environmental restoration or will bringing out environmental improvements. Along with environmental movements, Bottle also says that in the contemporary times, the states also will behave in a more environmental friendly way, or in other words, what he says that environmental that the states will behave as an environmental state, or state will behave as an environmental friendly state, because the legitimacy of the state lies in its commitment towards the nature. That state cannot openly say that it does not care for the nature. So, therefore, the state will derive its legitimacy by showing its concern for the nature. Consequently, the modern state will also come out with policies, will also come out with different kind of programs of environmental protection. So, therefore, state policies or state programs or state environmental regulations are also another mechanism through which environmental reforms or environmental improvements can be achieved. The third factor what Bottle argues is that of ecological modernization, which we will discuss just now. Ecological modernization is basically a process of modernization or a way of modernization which regards that if modernization produces environmental problems, then perhaps the solution for that lies in the modernization itself. So, basically what we require is a greener modernization, what we require is a cleaner modernization, where the process of modernization will continue, but along with restoring the nature, along with producing limited environmental degradations. And finally, Frederick Bottle says that environmental improvements cannot be brought forward by independent nation states, that improvements in environment requires intergovernmental cooperation, improvements in environment requires global level cooperation. So, therefore, Bottle argues that the 4 factors which will bring environmental reforms or which will bring environmental improvement are that of environmental movements and environmental state or environmental regulations by the state, to the process of ecological modernization and intergovernmental cooperation or global level cooperation. However, when we see in the last couple of decades, especially after 90s, we realize that there are 2 dominant approaches, 2 dominant theories which have emerged in environmental sociology, which talk about environmental reforms or which talk about environmental improvements. So, here basically we are drawing your attention to that of A.P.J. Moll's or A.P.J. Moll and Spargeren's theory of ecological modernization and Ulrich Beck's theory of the risk society. So, these 2 theories, ecological modernization and risk society, have emerged as dominant theoretical perspectives in environmental sociology in recent decades, which does not necessarily investigate the causes of environmental degradation. It does not explain what are the factors which produce environmental degradation. On the other hand, it basically explains that how environmental reforms can be brought forward, how environmental improvements can be brought forward. So, therefore, ecological modernization intends to transform the economy-ecology contradiction into one win-win situation. Ecological modernization basically says that it is wrong to perceive that there is a contradiction, there is a conflict between economy and ecology, that it is not necessary that economic growth will always produce ecological degradation. So, perhaps with modern technology, with new innovations, it is possible to come out with a process of modernization which does not necessarily lead to ecological degradation, or in other words, with super industrialization, with super modernization, with new technologies, with eco-friendly technologies, it is possible to continue the process of growth, to continue the process of modernization, but at the same time it is also possible to reduce the levels of environmental degradation. So, let us discuss briefly these two theoretical approaches of environmental improvements. Let us discuss now Ulrich Beck's the risk society thesis. Ulrich Beck is very much critical about modernity. He says that modern society is producing risk, that he says that in a modern society, risks are produced because of human intervention. So, it is the society which produces the risk. So, therefore, he terms this modern society as the risk society. But at the same time, he believes that if modernity has the capacity, at the same time, he believes that if these risks are produced by the modern society also has the capability to solve these problems. In other words, that modern society is a risk society, but how do we solve this the problem of risk? How do we find a solution to this risk? And he says that the solution also lies in modernity, that modernity produces both the risk and it also produces ways and mechanisms to adapt those risks. So, therefore, what he says that the risk society will not be only a society which will produce risk, but the risk society will also be geared up to find a solution or to find a process where it can mitigate these risks. But let us understand what is this risk society. Beck begins with the assumption that the modern Western society have now moved from a class or industrial society to that of a risk society. So, he makes a distinction, basic distinction between the class society or the industrial society and the risk society. And what is the basis of this distinction? He says that the basic function or the basic characteristics of a modern society or basic characteristics of a class or industrial society is to produce wealth. So, wealth production remains as the basic element of an industrial society, whereas risk production remains the basic element of a risk society. So, an industrial society was basically involved in a class society, while wealth are more unevenly distributed. What Beck says, and again he makes a distinction between the class society or the modern industrial society, which he terms as the class society, and that of the risk society. That in a class society or in an industrial society, wealth is more unevenly distributed. There is social disparity, there is social inequality in a class society, because different classes have access to different levels of resources. So, therefore, a class society is a highly unequal society so far as wealth distribution is concerned. But so far as risk distribution is concerned, so far as access to risk is concerned, risk society or in risk society, risks are more evenly distributed. Or in other words, what to summarize his argument, what he says that when society moves on from that of class society to that of risk society, that in class society wealth is unevenly distributed, whereas in a risk society risk is more evenly distributed. To quote again Ulrich Beck, he says that hunger is hierarchical, that you may find that some people have access to more food, some people have access to less food. So, therefore, there is hierarchy so far as access to food is concerned in a class society, but environmental problems like smog is more democratic, that environmental risk are more democratic, because environmental risk, the larger population are now facing the environmental risk. Environmental risks are class neutral, that environmental risk, I mean there is a lot of criticism towards it, but what Beck says that risk society, that in risk society risks are produced in a more democratic manner, where people from different economic classes, people from different regions, people from different economic categories, they all are facing the risk produced by the modernity. In other words, risks are defined as consequences of modernity. Again, Beck also makes an attempt to distinguish the contemporary risk which are produced by modernity from that of risk of the past, or from that of catastrophes or environmental problems of the past. What Beck argues basically is that risk of the current society are different from the past through their origin, scope, effect, difficulty of identification, and they transcend over space and time, that the modern risks are not confined with space and time. Let us take some example to understand this. Think about the Bhopal gas tragedy, or think about the Chernobyl nuclear explosion. So, the kind of risk which are produced by these kind of catastrophes, they are not limited to any specific geographical area, they are not limited to any specific time period, like the ecological risk of climate change. The ecological risk of climate change is not limited to any particular geographical area or to any particular time frame. So, in that sense, Beck argues that the risks which are produced by modernity, these ecological risks which are produced by modernity, they transcend time and space. And again he says that risks also have a boomerang effect, that in most cases we find that risks are produced by the modern society, by the modern advanced industrial society, and they are exported to the global south. But again these risks come back and haunt the modern societies. In other words, even though risks are produced by the modern society, modern industrial urban society, and there is an every attempt to push this risk, or there is a risk to export this risk to the global south, but both south and the north, or both industrial and the non-industrial societies are facing these risks. So what he basically tries to argue, that a particular society may be producing risk, but it is the globe, it is the global society, or it is the larger humanity as a whole that are subject to these risks. And again he says that risks are more or less invisible to the people. He says that these risks are such a kind of problem, or these risks are such a kind of risk that they are not visible to the common people. These risks can be identified only through modern scientific instrumentation, or these risks can only be identified through modern scientific knowledge. So therefore science plays a particular role in Beck's conceptualization of risk society. While on the one hand he says that science has lost its monopolic power that once it used to enjoy in an industrial society or a class society. So the science has lost his hegemonic homogenizing power, but at the same time science has become more and more necessary, because we need the scientific knowledge to understand this risk. We need scientific knowledge to find a solution towards this risk. So even though it is the modern science and modern technology produces this risk, what he says that these risks can also be solved with the help of modern science, with the help of modern technology. So therefore science becomes, in this risk society, science becomes more and more necessary, but less and less sufficient for socially binding definition of the truth. So in other words, there is a conflict between the scientific rationality and the social rationality. The role of science, or the dominating hegemonic role of the science, which once it used in a capitalist industrial society, that has been broken, and now there has been challenges to the scientific knowledge. But at the same time scientific knowledge has remained relevant, because it is only scientific technological knowledge which can provide a solution to improve the environment. In other words, Ulrich Beck's risk society thesis points out that these risks are a product of modernity, they are produced by the modern society, but at the same time it is the modern society, or it is the modern science and technology which has the ability to provide a solution to these kind of risks. Now let us come to the second theory of ecological improvement, that is the ecological modernization theory. We will discuss ecological modernization theory in detail in the coming classes, but now to give a brief introduction to the ecological modernization theory. Ecological modernization has been defined by APJ Moll and Spargaren as an ecological switch of the industrialization process that takes into account the maintenance of the existing sustenance base. In other words, ecological modernization has been defined as a process of modernization which will lead to continuation of the process of capitalism, continuation of the process of industrialization, continuation of the process of modernity, but at the same time which will also ensure that your sustenance base is not challenged, which will ensure that your sustenance base is maintained. In other words, ecological modernization talks about a kind of modernization which takes care of nature, which is completely aware that there is certain limitation, there are certain the resources are scarce, and within that maybe with the help of technology we can find a solution to the risk of modernity, or we can continue more and more modernity. So therefore ecological modernization theory basically indicates the possibility of overcoming environmental crisis without leaving the path of modernity. So the basic element of ecological modernization theory is that it argues for more and more modernity, it argues for super industrialization, it argues for super modernity, and it says that only super modernity or super technology has the solution for the problems created by this modernization. So ecological modernization visualizes that societies pass through three stages. So societies move through or grow through three stages. One which with the term as industrial breakthrough, in other words the industrial revolution or the phase of industrial revolution. Second, they say that is the construction of the industrial society, the age of modernity, and third they say that the ecological switchover, that a society after a certain level of modernity, after a sufficient level of modernity, there will be an ecological switchover of the modern society. What do we mean by this ecological switchover? Ecological switchover does not necessarily mean that the process of modernity will slow down. Ecological switchover means that process of modernity continue, maybe with more vigor and vitality, but there will be a consciousness about ecology. There will always be an awareness about ecology, and ecological switchover can take place with the help of super industrialization. So, therefore, ecological modernization basically emphasizes on large scale production consumption system or production consumption cycle through new sophisticated and clean technology. What ecological modernization emphasizes, not slowing down the process of growth, slowing down the process of modernity, rather it talks about increasing the process of growth or enhancing the process of modernity, but what really matters in this case is what kind of technology that you are using. It says that with the help of modern technology, with the help of modern sophisticated technology, it is possible that we can eradicate the ecological problems. So, therefore, it talks about an ecological turn, ecological switchover of the Western societies. And ecological modernization also talks about green capitalism, in the sense that continuing the process of capitalism, but which is completely which is aware, which is informed by the ecological limits. Ecological modernization also talks about green capitalism and ecologization of capitalism. In other words, ecological modernization theory says that it is quite possible to continue the process of modernity while at the same time showing concern for the nature. So, therefore, ecological modernization tries to maintain a balance between two things. On the one hand, it tries to continue the process of growth, tries to continue the process of modernity, process of capitalism or process of development. On the other hand, it also talks about maintaining the basic subsistence system, maintaining the basic ecological system. In other words, ecological modernization theory talks about modernization in an eco-friendly way, or modernization in a more environmentally informed, environmentally conscious manner.